The 23rd of August 1942. Stalingrad, southern Russia. The Luftwaffe's bombers roared overhead like iron thunder, their engines tearing at the sky as they came in low over the Volga. Below them, the city burned. Sergeant Karl-Heinz Reuter of the 6th Army shielded his eyes as a wall of black smoke rolled across the steppe, swallowing factories, apartments, and rail yards in a single choking mass. The heat from the fires pressed against his face even from miles away, and the ground trembled as if Stalingrad itself were recoiling from the assault. Reuter had marched for weeks to reach this place, his boots worn thin by the endless dust of southern Russia. The men had been told Stalingrad was just another objective. But as the smoke rose higher and the Volga shimmered beneath the August sun, something felt different. This was no ordinary battlefield. This was a city being erased. Columns of German infantry advanced along shattered roads, moving past wrecked Soviet trucks and abandoned artillery. The air smelled of burning grain and oil. In the distance, anti-aircraft fire cracked weakly, almost defiant in its futility. No one spoke of home. At 6th Army headquarters, General Friedrich Paulus studied his maps under flickering lamplight. He was a meticulous man, precise to the point of hesitation, and the situation unfolding before him demanded decisions he was unprepared to make alone. Red grease pencil lines showed German spearheads slicing toward the Volga. But beyond the city, the map stretched into a vast, empty nothing. The flanks held by Romanian and Italian units were thin, under strength, and exposed. Paulus knew it. His staff knew it, and reports were already arriving that the Soviets were massing forces far to the north and south. Colonel Wilhelm Adam, Paulus's chief of staff, read aloud an intelligence summary from Army Group B. Rail traffic suggested reinforcements arriving from Siberia and the Urals. The words hung in the room like an unspoken warning. Paulus said nothing at first. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes returning to the city's name printed in bold letters on the map. Stalingrad, a city that carried the enemy leader's name, heavy with symbolism. Orders from Berlin were clear. The city must fall, far from the headquarters, in a shallow trench on the city's outskirts. He wiped grime from his rifle and listened to the distant whine of aircraft engines. His unit had been shattered by the bombing. Half his men were dead or missing. Yet orders were equally clear on his side. Stalingrad must not fall, not one step back. The first German troops reached the Volga that afternoon, cutting the city in half. The river glistened deceptively calm, its surface broken by burning debris and the silhouettes of Soviet ferries racing back and forth under fire. Reuter watched as shells landed in the water, throwing up white columns of spray. On the opposite bank, Soviet artillery answered, the thunder rolling across the river like a challenge. By nightfall, the city was a maze of flames and ruins. German units pushed forward street by street, factory by factory. The fighting was brutal, intimate, and relentless. Men died for stairwells, for shattered walls, for rooms filled with dust and corpses. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War, and the name stuck because nothing else fit. As September dragged on, casualties mounted at a pace that shocked even veterans of the Eastern Front. Soviet resistance did not collapse, it hardened. Each destroyed factory became a fortress, each cellar a death trap. Paulus sent message after message up the chain of command, requesting reinforcements, warning of exhaustion, pointing again to the vulnerable flanks. The replies from Berlin were polite, encouraging, and dismissive. At the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler paced as generals briefed him on the situation. He listened, expression unreadable, then waved away concerns about the Don flanks. The Red Army, he insisted, was finished. Any Soviet buildup was merely defensive. 6th Army needed only to complete its task. Retreat was unthinkable. Back in Stalingrad, the weather began to turn. Autumn rains transformed dirt roads into rivers of mud. Supplies lagged behind the front lines. Ammunition ran low. Food was rationed. Reuter scribbled in a small notebook during rare moments of rest, noting, How many men were gone from his platoon? Each day, the number grew. In October, reports from German intelligence officers grew more alarming. Reconnaissance flights spotted Soviet armor concentrations beyond the range of German artillery. Paulus forwarded the information upward, careful in his wording, cautious not to sound alarmist. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky finalized their plans. Operation Uranus was being assembled with meticulous secrecy. Fresh divisions, tanks, and artillery were positioned far from the city, hidden in forests and ravines. The Red Army did not intend to retake Stalingrad street by street. It intended to cut the Germans off and destroy them whole. On the front lines, few German soldiers sensed the scale of what was coming. They were consumed by survival, by the next firefight, the next bombardment. But some felt it in their bones. Reuter noticed how Soviet attacks, once desperate and disorganized, now seemed probing, deliberate. The enemy was feeling for weak points. By early November, snowflakes began to fall, melting on contact with the still warm rubble. Winter was arriving, and with it, a silence that felt ominous rather than peaceful. Paulus stood once more over his maps, tracing the thin lines of Allied units guarding his flanks. He had been warned. He had warned others. And yet, the army remained where it was, locked in a city that refused to die. The trap was being set, even as the battle for Stalingrad raged on, and the men of the Sixth Army fought on, unaware that their greatest danger was no longer in front of them, but closing quietly from the open steppe behind. The 17th of November, 1942, Kalach-on-Don, Western Steppe. The wind cut across the open steppe like a blade, carrying with it the scent of snow and diesel fuel. Sergeant Ivan Petrov crouched beside his T-34, his breath fogging in the pre-dawn darkness as mechanics tightened bolts and checked tracks by the glow of hooded lanterns. Engines rumbled quietly across the frozen ground, hundreds of them, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. Orders had come down hours earlier. By morning, the waiting would end. Petrov pulled his greatcoat tighter and glanced toward the west, where the Don River curved through the darkness. Somewhere beyond it, German and Romanian troops held the line, thinly spread, underarmed, and unsuspecting. The Red Army had learned patience the hard way. Now it would strike with everything it had. Across the river, Romanian Third Army positions lay silent. Trenches were shallow, dug into ground already stiffening with frost. Lieutenant Nicolae Dumitrescu peered through binoculars, scanning the pale horizon. His men had little more than anti-tank rifles and outdated artillery. They had been promised German support, German armor, German air cover. What they had instead were rumors of Soviet tanks massing somewhere beyond sight, of strange movements at night, of an enemy that had not been broken at Stalingrad after all. Dumitrescu lowered the binoculars and rubbed his hands together. The cold bit hard, but it was the unease that troubled him more. Radio traffic had increased over the past days, yet no clear warnings had come down. German liaison officers assured him everything was under control. The Romanians were to hold their sector. That was all. Inside Stalingrad, the battle raged on with numbing familiarity. On the factory floors of Red October and Barricade, German and Soviet troops fought at distances measured in feet. Corporal Hans Müller fired his MP-40 down a shattered hallway, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating twisted machinery and fallen bodies. The walls shook as artillery slammed into the ruins above. There was no sense of front or rear anymore, only enemy and not enemy, life and sudden death. Müller had heard nothing of what was happening beyond the Don. Few soldiers had. Their world was reduced to rubble, smoke, and the next order shouted through the chaos. When the guns paused, even briefly, the silence felt wrong, as if the city itself were holding its breath. At Sixth Army headquarters, Paulus received yet another intelligence report. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed large Soviet troop concentrations north of Stalingrad, opposite the Romanian lines. The tone of the report was cautious, almost apologetic, but the implication was clear. Something was coming. Paulus dictated a message to Army Group B, emphasizing the danger to his flanks and requesting permission to shorten the line, to pull back slightly and consolidate. He chose his words carefully, as he always did. He did not use the word retreat. The reply came hours later. The Führer expected 6th Army to maintain its positions. Any Soviet attack would be repelled. The Luftwaffe would ensure supply and support. Paulus read the message twice, then folded it neatly and placed it on his desk. His face betrayed little, but those who knew him sensed the strain. He was a commander, bound by obedience, trapped between what he saw and what he was allowed to do. On the Soviet side, commanders finalized the timing. General Nikolai Vatutin and General Konstantin Rokossovsky stood over maps in a dimly lit bunker, tracing attack axes with gloved fingers. Artillery units were positioned wheel to wheel, barrels aligned with mathematical precision. Thousands of guns, mortars, and rocket launchers waited in silence. At 7:20 a.m., the stillness broke. The first salvo from the Soviet artillery ripped across the Romanian positions like a storm. The ground erupted as shells slammed into trenches, command posts, and artillery emplacements. Men were thrown into the air, weapons torn from their hands. Communication lines vanished in seconds. The barrage did not lift. It intensified. Lieutenant Dumitrescu was knocked flat as the earth around him exploded. When he staggered to his feet, dazed and bleeding, he saw tanks emerging from the smoke. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. T-34 seconds and KV-1 second advanced relentlessly, their tracks crushing wire and bodies alike. Romanian anti-tank rifles fired until barrels glowed, rounds sparking uselessly off sloped armor. Within hours, the Romanian Third Army was collapsing. Soviet infantry poured through, supported by armor and close air support. German reserves, few and far between, were too distant to respond in time. To the south, a mirror of the same disaster unfolded against the Romanian Fourth Army. Soviet forces smashed through with equal ferocity, their advance coordinated, disciplined, unstoppable. What had once been a thin defensive arc around 6th Army now shattered like glass. By midday, reports flooded into Paulus's headquarters. Soviet armor was advancing rapidly toward Kalach, threatening the bridges over the Don, the lifeline of 6th Army. Paulus stood motionless as officers spoke over one another. Maps spread across tables, red arrows multiplying by the minute. He ordered what reserves he had elements of the 16th Panzer Division to counterattack, but it was a gesture against a tidal wave. The Soviets had achieved total surprise and overwhelming superiority. In the streets of Stalingrad, the sounds of battle continued, but something subtle shifted. German soldiers noticed fewer supply trucks arriving, fewer aircraft overhead. Ammunition shortages grew acute. Müller counted his remaining magazines and realized how little he had left. On November 19, Soviet tank crews pushed forward relentlessly, bypassing pockets of resistance, leaving infantry to mop up behind them. The objective was no longer Stalingrad itself, but the ring forming around it. Every mile gained tightened the noose. At Kalach, German engineers attempted to organize a defense around the vital bridges. But Soviet tanks arrived faster than expected, bursting through defensive positions under covering fire. By evening, the bridges were in Soviet hands. The jaws of the encirclement snapped shut. Paulus received confirmation just before midnight. Soviet forces from the north and south had linked up west of Stalingrad. 6th Army was surrounded. For the first time since the campaign began, Paulus allowed himself to say the word aloud, encircled. Outside, snow began to fall again, settling quietly over burning villages, wrecked tanks, and the bodies of the dead. The great maneuver battle the Germans had once mastered had turned against them with brutal finality, and deep within the ruins of Stalingrad, an entire army had just realized it was trapped. The 22nd of November 1942. The snow fell in slow, steady sheets, muffling the distant thunder of artillery, as if the land itself were trying to quiet the catastrophe it had just witnessed. Inside a ruined schoolhouse on the western edge of Stalingrad, Captain Ernst Vogel stared at the radio operator, waiting for the message to change. It did not. Soviet forces had linked up near Kalach. The roads to the west were gone. Sixth Army was sealed inside a vast frozen pocket. Vogel stepped outside into the gray dawn. Smoke drifted low across the rubble, mixing with the snow to form a dirty haze that stung the eyes. Somewhere nearby, a wounded horse screamed before falling silent. German soldiers moved through the ruins with the dull, mechanical motions of men, too exhausted to panic, yet too experienced not to understand what encirclement meant on the Eastern Front. At Paulus's headquarters, the confirmation arrived piece by piece. Reports from reconnaissance units went silent. Supply convoys failed to return. Luftwaffe pilots reported Soviet fighters patrolling airspace once considered safe. The map on the wall, once cluttered with arrows pointing eastward, now showed a tightening red ring around Stalingrad. General Friedrich Paulus sat at his desk, hands folded, listening. But his eyes betrayed a growing sense of disbelief. For months, he had warned of this possibility. For months, those warnings had been dismissed. Now, the nightmare scenario had become reality. Colonel Adams spoke quietly. The estimated strength of the encircled forces stood at over 250,000 men. Germans, Romanians, Italians, and auxiliary units. Ammunition stocks were already low. Fuel reserves were dangerously thin. Winter clothing was insufficient for a prolonged siege. The words came out clinically, but every man in the room knew what they implied. Paulus dictated a message to Army Group B, requesting immediate authorization to break out to the west while it was still possible. His voice was calm, precise. The proposal was clear. Abandon Stalingrad, concentrate remaining armor, and fight through the weakest point of the Soviet ring before it solidified. The response from Berlin arrived within hours. Hold positions. Stalingrad must be held at all costs. The Sixth Army would be supplied by air. The word struck the headquarters like a physical blow. Several officers exchanged glances, but said nothing. Paulus closed his eyes briefly, then straightened. As a field marshal might one day do, he obeyed. Inside the city, the realization spread unevenly. Some units learned quickly, others fought on unaware, believing the front still existed somewhere beyond the smoke. Sergeant Karl-Heinz Reuter heard the news from a courier who arrived breathless, his face pale beneath layers of grime. "We're surrounded," the man said simply. Reuter felt the words settle in his chest like ice. He looked around at the ruins that had already consumed so many lives and wondered how they were supposed to fight their way out of a city they had never truly conquered. The Luftwaffe sprang into action almost immediately. At airfields in Tatsinskaya and Morozovskaya, transport crews prepared Ju-52 seconds and He-111 seconds for non-stop supply missions. Pilots knew the numbers as well as the generals did. Sixth Army needed at least 500 tons of supplies per day to survive. The Luftwaffe could deliver, at best, a fraction of that on good days, in good weather, without interference. Those conditions no longer existed. Soviet fighters prowled the skies, while anti-aircraft guns ringed the pocket. Snowstorms reduced visibility to nothing. Airstrips inside the encirclement were crude, overcrowded, and under constant artillery fire. Planes crashed on landing or failed to return at all. Still, the airlift began. Parachutes blossomed over the ruins, carrying crates of ammunition, bread, and medical supplies. Too often, they drifted into Soviet-held territory. Too often, they never came. Corporal Hans Müller watched one such drop from the shell of a factory wall. The parachutes descended slowly, helplessly, as Soviet machine guns opened up. Crates burst open on impact, spilling food and bandages into the snow. Müller felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat. This was what Berlin called supply. On the Soviet side, commanders moved swiftly to strengthen the encirclement. General Konstantin Rokossovsky ordered fresh units forward, sealing gaps and establishing layered defenses. Minefields were laid. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover likely breakout routes. The ring was no longer a thin line, it was becoming a fortress facing inward. Red Army soldiers dug in with grim determination. They had learned from bitter experience what happened when encircled enemies were allowed to escape. This time, there would be no relief. In Stalingrad, temperatures plunged below freezing. Men scavenged for fuel, burning furniture, books, even wooden rifle stocks to keep warm. Frostbite cases surged. Wounded soldiers lay in unheated cellars, their breath forming white clouds as medics worked with numb fingers and dwindling supplies. Paulus toured forward positions, speaking softly with officers and enlisted men alike. He avoided making promises. He spoke of duty, of endurance, of holding on until relief arrived. Some believed him, others did not, but they listened, because there was little else to do. In Berlin, Hitler addressed his inner circle with unwavering confidence. Sixth Army, he declared, would become a fortress on the Volga. The Soviets would bleed themselves white, trying to destroy it. Air supply would suffice. A relief operation would be prepared in due time. No one contradicted him. By the end of November, the Soviet ring was complete and unyielding. Attempts to probe the perimeter met with fierce resistance. German counterattacks sputtered and failed, their tanks immobilized by lack of fuel or destroyed by well-sighted Soviet guns. Inside the pocket, the men of Sixth Army began to understand that this was no temporary setback. As night fell over Stalingrad, the fires burned lower, the gunfire lessened, and the cold deepened. In the silence, broken only by the distant crack of artillery, an entire army waited, trapped between obedience and annihilation, clinging to orders that offered hope in words, but none in reality. The 1st of December 1942. The roar of aircraft engines echoed across the frozen plain as a Ju-52 transport lurched down the icy strip, its tires skidding before finally lifting into the gray sky. Below, Potomnik Airfield was a chaos of snow, wreckage, and exhausted men. Ground crews waved frantically, guiding planes in through drifting fog and artillery smoke, while stretcher-bearers carried the wounded toward waiting aircraft, with the desperate urgency of men racing death itself. Lieutenant Franz Keller, a Luftwaffe transport pilot, wiped frost from his goggles as his aircraft settled onto the runway. His hands shook, partly from the cold, partly from exhaustion. He had flown 3 sorties in the past 24 hours, threading his way through Soviet flak and fighters to bring in supplies that never seemed enough. As soon as his wheels touched down, shells began to fall at the edge of the field, sending fountains of dirt and ice skyward. There was no time to rest. Engines were kept running, while crates were pushed out and wounded men loaded in. The air reeked of fuel, blood, and fear. Keller glanced back into the fuselage, where gaunt soldiers with hollow eyes clutched their rifles, as if afraid someone might take them away. Others lay silent on stretchers, their faces waxen, their breath shallow. In theory, the airlift was the answer to everything. In Berlin, Hermann Göring had assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply Sixth Army entirely by air. It was a promise made without calculation, driven more by pride than reality. In practice, the numbers never added up. Inside the pocket, daily rations were slashed again and again. Bread was reduced to a few ounces. Horse meat became a staple. Ammunition was carefully counted before every engagement. Medical supplies ran out first. Surgeons operated without anesthetic, their patients biting down on rags to stifle their screams. Sergeant Karl-Heinz Reuter stood in line for his ration near a shattered warehouse. Snow crunched underfoot as men waited in silence, each holding a dented mess tin. When his turn came, the ladle dipped once, hesitated, then poured a thin soup flecked with grease and bone fragments. Reuter ate slowly, savoring each mouthful despite the taste. Hunger had become a constant companion, gnawing and relentless. At Paulus's headquarters, daily airlift figures were reviewed with growing alarm. Weather, enemy action, and mechanical failures took a relentless toll. Planes went down in flames across the steppe, their crews burned or captured. Others crash-landed inside the pocket, adding to the debris, littering the airfields. Paulus sent another message requesting permission to attempt a breakout toward the southwest, where General Erich von Manstein was assembling a relief force. Again, the answer from Hitler was no. Manstein, commanding the newly formed Army Group Dawn, read Paulus's messages with frustration. He understood the situation all too well. The relief operation, codenamed Winter Storm, would require 6th Army to break out and meet his advancing panzers. Without that cooperation, his forces alone could not punch through the Soviet defenses. Yet the order never came. On December 12, Manstein launched his attack from the south. Panzer divisions surged forward, across the frozen steppe, their engines roaring as they drove toward the pocket. For a brief moment, hope flickered among the trapped troops. Distant artillery could be heard. Rumors spread like wildfire. The relief was coming. Reuter and his comrades listened for signs of salvation, straining to hear the sound of friendly tanks. Some swore they could hear it, faint but unmistakable. Others said nothing, unwilling to believe in hope that might vanish as quickly as it appeared. Inside Paulus's headquarters, the situation maps showed Manstein's forces advancing steadily, but also revealed the grim truth. Soviet reserves were being rushed to block the relief attempt. The Red Army had anticipated this move and was reacting with speed and strength. As Winter Storm stalled just short of the pocket, Manstein sent urgent messages urging Paulus to break out immediately. The opportunity, though narrow, still existed. Every hour mattered. Paulus hesitated not from indecision, but from obedience. Without explicit authorization from Hitler, he would not order a breakout. To do so would mean defying the Führer directly, an act few German generals were willing to contemplate. The airlift continued, grinding on despite impossible odds. Keller flew again and again, watching comrades vanish into the snow. Their aircraft shot down or forced to land behind enemy lines. Each mission felt like a gamble with death, and the house always seemed to win. By mid-December, Soviet pressure intensified and took off with wounded men stacked like cargo. Inside the city, morale eroded steadily. The promise of air supply rang hollow as hunger and cold took their toll. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes. Lice-infested uniforms hung loose on emaciated bodies. Men spoke less, conserving energy as if words themselves required calories. Paulus walked alone one evening through the snow-covered ruins, his boots crunching softly. The city that had consumed so much blood now consumed hope as well. He knew the truth, even if he could not say it aloud. The airlift was not salvation. It was prolongation. As December wore on, the illusion of rescue from the sky began to fade. Each plane that failed to arrive, each ration cut further, stripped away another layer of belief. The 6th Army remained in place, holding ruins that no longer mattered, sustained by promises that fell from the sky in ever smaller amounts, while the Soviet ring tightened with cold, methodical certainty. The 16th of December, 1942, Kotelnikovo, southern steppe. The ground shook as German panzers surged forward through the frozen dawn, exhaust flames flickering blue against the snow. Oberleutnant Heinrich Bormann gripped the edge of his Panzer IV's turret, scanning the horizon through binoculars rimmed with ice. This was Operation Winter Storm, the last real chance to reach the trapped 6th Army. Somewhere far to the north, beyond the white emptiness of the steppe, over 200,000 German soldiers waited for the sound of his engines. Bormann's tank battalion advanced in tight formation, tracks grinding over hard-packed snow. The men were veterans. Many pulled from France and refitted for this desperate gamble. They knew what was at stake. Every kilometer gained meant fewer comrades freezing and starving in Stalingrad. Every delay meant the opposite. At first, progress was rapid. Soviet outposts were overrun. Anti-tank guns crushed beneath steel treads. German artillery followed close behind, firing over open sights. The landscape offered little cover rolling steppe, broken only by low ridges and frozen ravines. But speed, was their ally. Then the resistance hardened. Soviet anti-tank guns opened fire from concealed positions, shells slamming into the lead panzers with deafening force. One tank erupted in flame, its turret blown askew. Another slewed sideways, tracks shattered. Bormann ducked instinctively as a shell screamed overhead, detonating behind them in a plume of snow and earth. Radio traffic crackled with urgency. Soviet armor was moving to intercept. Fresh divisions were being rushed south, just as German intelligence had feared. The Red Army had not only anticipated winter storm, it had prepared for it. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, the distant rumble of artillery carried faintly through the cold air. Sergeant Karl-Heinz Reuter paused mid-step in a ruined courtyard, listening. The sound was real. It was not imagination. Somewhere beyond the horizon, German guns were firing outward. Hope flared, fragile and dangerous. Word spread quickly through the ruins. Manstein was coming. The relief force was on the move. Men straightened their backs. Officers spoke with renewed urgency. Even hunger felt, for a moment, less sharp. At 6th Army headquarters, Paulus studied the reports from Manstein with intense focus. The relief force had reached the Maishkova River. The distance to the pocket had narrowed to less than 50 kilometers. Manstein's message was clear and direct. 6th Army must break out now, or be lost. Paulus drafted a response. He outlined the dire state of his troops, the lack of fuel, the weakness of his remaining armor. A breakout would be costly, but possible if ordered immediately. He sent the message upward, knowing time was bleeding away with every passing hour. The reply from Hitler came swiftly and decisively. 6th Army was to hold its positions, no breakout. Stalingrad was to remain a fortress on the Volga. Paulus read the order in silence. The weight of it pressed down on him, heavier than any bombardment. To disobey would mean defying the Führer directly, an act that could end his career, or worse. To obey meant condemning his army to slow destruction. He obeyed. Manstein, upon receiving Paulus's response, understood the truth at once. Without a breakout from inside, winter storm could not succeed. His panzers were already stretched thin, fuel running low, casualties mounting. Soviet pressure increased by the hour. On December 19, Soviet counteroffensives slammed into Manstein's flanks. Fresh tank corps, well supported by artillery and infantry, drove hard against the German spearhead. The steppe became a killing ground once more, smoke and fire staining the snow black. Bormann's battalion fought desperately to hold ground. His tanks shuddered under repeated hits, armor plates ringing like bells. Through his optics, he watched Soviet T-34 advancing head-on, fearless and relentless. The enemy had learned the cost of hesitation. By December 23, winter storm stalled. German units were forced onto the defensive, then ordered to withdraw to avoid encirclement themselves. The relief attempt was over. Inside Stalingrad, the sound of distant guns faded. Reuter felt the silence settle like a verdict. The Soviet High Command wasted no time. Even as winter storm collapsed, Operation Little Saturn was unleashed against the Italian 8th Army guarding the German rear. Entire formations disintegrated under the assault, ensuring that no second relief attempt could even be imagined. The noose around Stalingrad tightened further. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Weapons froze. Oil thickened to sludge. Men wrapped rags around their boots and hands, anything to keep flesh from turning black. Frostbite cases skyrocketed. Gangrene followed. At the airfields, the situation became catastrophic. Pitomnik fell under direct Soviet assault on January 16. Gumrak followed soon after. With their loss went the last usable runways. Supplies could only be dropped by parachute now, wildly inaccurate and dangerously exposed. Lieutenant Franz Keller flew one of the final missions before the airfields were lost. His aircraft took heavy fire on approach, shrapnel tearing through the fuselage. He managed to release his cargo before pulling away. the plane limping back west with wounded aboard. As Stalingrad disappeared behind him, Keller knew he would never land there again. Inside the pocket, hospitals overflowed. Wounded men lay packed together for warmth, their moans barely audible over the wind. Doctors chose who might live and who would be given morphine to ease the end. Even morphine ran out. Paulus issued orders for continued resistance, though he knew they rang hollow. Ammunition was nearly gone. Units were shadows of themselves. Entire regiments existed only on paper. Soviet loudspeakers crackled to life along the front lines, broadcasting offers of surrender, promises of food, warmth, survival. German soldiers listened in silence, some with rage, others with something dangerously close to longing. Hitler responded by promoting Paulus to field marshal on the 30th of January, 1943, a rank no German officer had ever surrendered under. The message was unmistakable. Paulus was expected to die. He did not. As January ended, the pocket was split in two by a massive Soviet offensive. The northern group, isolated and leaderless, collapsed first. Resistance became sporadic, then ceased altogether. In the southern pocket, Paulus sat in the basement of a department store, the walls shaking as Soviet artillery closed in. Maps were meaningless now. Orders changed nothing. The gamble of winter storm had failed. The illusion of rescue had burned away, leaving only cold reality behind. The Wehrmacht had been warned. It had been given chances. And now, in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the 10th of January 1943, southern Stalingrad pocket, the dawn came without light, only a deeper shade of gray pressed down by the weight of sound. Soviet artillery opened fire in a continuous roar, thousands of guns firing in unison, the concussion rolling across the ruins like an unending earthquake. Sergeant Karl-Heinz Reuter lay curled in a shallow trench, hands clamped over his helmet as the ground bucked beneath him. Snow, brick dust, and shattered concrete rained down, filling the air with choking clouds that tasted of cordite and stone. This was Operation Ring, the final act. For weeks, the Soviets had tightened their grip, compressing the pocket, starving it of airfields, fuel, and hope. Now they came to finish what Operation Uranus had begun. The bombardment did not pause for adjustment or assessment. It was methodical, overwhelming, designed not merely to kill, but to break what little cohesion remained. When the guns finally lifted, Red Army infantry advanced behind tanks that crawled forward like iron beasts emerging from the smoke. Loudspeakers blared, surrender appeals in halting German. Your situation is hopeless. Lay down your arms. You will be fed. The words floated over the battlefield, absurd and tempting all at once. German machine guns answered weakly. Ammunition was precious now. Each burst was measured, each round debated. Many weapons did not fire at all, their mechanisms frozen solid. Reuter tried to clear his rifle, fingers numb despite layers of cloth, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. Across the shattered city, resistance crumbled unevenly. Some units fought fiercely, clinging to ruins with the stubbornness born of discipline and despair. Others simply dissolved, men slipping away into cellars, tunnels, or the snow-covered wasteland beyond the lines, where they were soon captured or killed. In the southern pocket, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus remained in command, though command itself had become a hollow concept. Orders were passed verbally, often too late to matter. Paulus's headquarters had been forced underground into the basement of the Univermag department store, a damp, freezing warren lit by candles and a single generator that sputtered unpredictably. Paulus listened as his staff reported the situation. Soviet forces had broken through again. The pocket was shrinking by the hour. Food stocks were effectively gone. Many men had not eaten in days. Horses had long since been slaughtered. Even dogs and rats were disappearing. Colonel Wilhelm Adam spoke quietly, his voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into his face. The army could no longer fight as an organized force. The choice, unspoken but unavoidable, lay before them. Paulus said nothing. He stared at the map on the wall, its symbols now meaningless. The city, the Volga, the front lines all had collapsed into a single, suffocating reality. On the northern side of the encirclement, General Karl Strecker commanded what remained of Levensai Army Corps. His men were in even worse shape. Isolated entirely after the Soviets split the pocket, ammunition had run out almost completely. Wounded men lay unattended in frozen trenches. Strecker knew his end was approaching. On January 26, Soviet forces linked up at Mamayev Kurgan, severing the pocket decisively. German resistance in the north disintegrated under relentless assault. Strecker radioed his final report, then ordered his men to destroy their weapons. On January 31, Soviet troops closed in on the Univermag building. The sound of tank engines reverberated through the basement walls. Dust drifted down with every near miss. Paulus sat at a wooden table, wearing his greatcoat, his field marshal's baton lying untouched beside him. A Soviet officer descended the stairs, flanked by armed soldiers. The war, for him, had ended in that moment, not with glory or defiance, but with quiet exhaustion. Word of the surrender spread rapidly through the southern pocket. Some units laid down their arms immediately. Others continued fighting, either unaware or unwilling to accept what had happened. The North held out for 2 more days, Strecker surrendering on February 2. For the men of 6th Army, surrender was not an end to suffering, but a transition into another kind of ordeal. Soviet guards herded starving, frost-bitten prisoners into columns. Many collapsed where they stood, too weak to march. Those who could walk shuffled eastward through the snow, leaving behind the ruins that had consumed their army. Reuter stood among them, his rifle gone, his hands empty. He looked back once at the shattered skyline of Stalingrad, smoke still rising lazily into the winter sky. The city was silent now, its battle over at last. Of the more than 250,000 Axis soldiers encircled in November, fewer than 100,000 went into captivity. Of those, only a fraction would ever return home. Disease, exposure, and exhaustion claimed tens of thousands in the weeks that followed. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was a triumph beyond measure, a turning point forged in blood and ice. For Germany, it was a catastrophe unlike any before, a blow not just to its armies, but to the myth of invincibility that had carried it across Europe. As the last shots faded and the wind swept snow across the ruins, the truth settled in with the cold. The Wehrmacht had been warned about Stalingrad. It had seen the danger forming on its flanks. And yet, bound by orders and belief, it had remained until the trap closed completely, and the fortress on the Volga became a grave. The 3rd of February 1943. Outskirts of Stalingrad. The wind scoured the open ground where the ruins gave way to frozen fields, cutting through threadbare uniforms and exposed skin with merciless precision. Columns of German prisoners stretched across the snow like a slow-moving scar. Thousands of men stumbling eastward under the watch of Red Army guards. Sergeant Karl-Heinz Reuter shuffled forward, head down, his breath rasping in his chest. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself were trying to pull him under. The battle was over, but survival was not assured. Reuter's boots were split open at the seams, wrapped with rags and wire in a futile attempt to keep out the cold. Frostbite had already claimed 2 of his toes. He could no longer feel them. Around him, men leaned on one another for support, some mumbling incoherently, others silent and glassy-eyed. Those who fell were prodded to their feet if they could move. If they could not, the column marched on without them. Soviet guards, themselves hardened by years of brutal war, moved alongside the prisoners with rifles slung and expressions unreadable. They shouted orders in Russian, gestures sharp and impatient. There was little cruelty for cruelty's sake, only indifference. The war had burned that out of most men long ago. Behind them, Stalingrad smoldered in quiet ruin. The city that had swallowed an army now receded into the gray haze, its broken factories and collapsed apartment blocks fading from view. For many of the prisoners, it was the last place they would ever see. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus was transported separately, taken under guard to Soviet headquarters. His surrender was a propaganda victory of immense value. The first German field marshal ever captured alive. The symbol of defeat, embodied in a single man. Soviet officers treated him correctly, even formally, but there was no mistaking the reality. He was no longer a commander, he was evidence. For the rank and file, there were no speeches, no ceremony, only the march. The columns moved for hours, then days. Men fought over scraps with the last of their strength, then felt shame for it afterward. Dysentery spread quickly. Lice crawled freely. Typhus followed close behind. Corporal Hans Müller walked a few rows ahead of Reuter. His once broad shoulders slumped inward. He had lost weight so rapidly that his uniform hung loose, cinched at the waist with a belt punched with extra holes. He no longer spoke. His eyes were fixed on the boots of the man in front of him, as if that narrow strip of ground was all that existed in the world. Occasionally, the column passed wreckage left behind by the battle-burned-out tanks, shattered guns, frozen bodies half buried by drifting snow. Some prisoners recognized units, even individuals. No one stopped. At night, the columns halted wherever darkness found them. There were no tents, no fires. Men huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat in tight knots that reeked of sickness and fear. Those who died in the night were discovered at dawn, stiff and silent, their faces pale beneath a dusting of snow. Guards ordered the living to move on. Reuter learned quickly not to look back. The Soviet system was unprepared for the sheer scale of prisoners taken at Stalingrad. Camps were improvised fenced fields, abandoned villages, makeshift enclosures guarded by exhausted soldiers. Medical care was minimal. Food supplies were stretched thin by the needs of the Red Army itself. The result was catastrophic. By mid-February, tens of thousands of prisoners were already dead. In one camp near Beketovka, men collapsed by the dozens as they arrived, their bodies simply unable to endure another step. Soviet medics moved through the ranks, selecting those who might still be saved and those who could not. The distinction was often made in seconds, based on little more than experience and instinct. Reuter survived that first selection. Müller did not. Müller collapsed during roll call, his knees buckling beneath him. But a guard pushed him back into line. Müller was carried away with others to a separate area. Reuter never saw him again. For Paulus and other senior officers, captivity followed a different path. Paulus, once the embodiment of obedience, now found himself reflecting on the decisions that had led him to that basement in Stalingrad. He would later speak openly against Hitler, but for now, he remained quiet, withdrawn, processing defeat in solitude. News of Stalingrad's fall spread rapidly across the world. In Germany, the shock was profound. For the first time, the regime declared national mourning. Churches were filled. Black flags hung from buildings. The myth of inevitable victory had been shattered beyond repair. On the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers celebrated briefly, then returned to their duties. There was no time for extended triumph. The war was far from over, and new battles already loomed on the horizon. But Stalingrad had changed everything. The initiative had shifted, decisively and irrevocably. For the prisoners, time lost meaning. Days blurred into one another, measured only by hunger and cold. Those who survived the first weeks were transported further east, packed into trains, or marched onward toward camps deep in the Soviet interior. Each transfer claimed more lives. Reuter found himself on a cattle car weeks later, pressed against strangers, the air thick with the stench of sickness. The train lurched forward, its destination unknown. He closed his eyes and thought of home not as a place he expected to see again, but as something to hold on to while everything else was stripped away. Of the nearly 100,000 men taken prisoner at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 would eventually return to Germany years later. The rest vanished into the frozen margins of history, victims not just of battle, but of decisions made far above their heads. As the trains carried them eastward and the steppe rolled by in endless white, the final truth of Stalingrad became clear. The Wehrmacht had not merely lost an army. It had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. A moment where warnings ignored and orders obeyed had led, inexorably, to annihilation. The 18th of February 1943. The air inside the sport palace was thick with heat, bodies, and anticipation. Thousands of faces stared toward the podium as Joseph Goebbels stepped forward, his voice rising with practiced intensity. Outside, snow clung to the streets of the capital, but inside, the regime was fighting for something far more fragile than territory. "Do you want total war?" Goebbels shouted, his words echoing off the high walls. The roar that answered him was loud, rehearsed, and desperate. Just weeks earlier, the truth about Stalingrad had broken through the layers of censorship and propaganda. At first, the German public had been told of heroic resistance, of an army holding firm against overwhelming odds. Then came the announcement that could not be softened. Sixth Army had ceased fighting. An entire field army had been destroyed. No victory parade. No orderly withdrawal. Only loss. In homes across Germany, families gathered around radios in stunned silence. Mothers clutched photographs of sons who would never return. Wives reread the last letters they had received, now knowing there would be no more. For the first time since 1939, defeat was undeniable, and it carried a scale that could not be explained away. The regime declared 3 days of national mourning. Flags flew at half-mast. Church bells tolled. Newspapers printed lists of fallen units instead of names, because the names were too many. Entire divisions were gone. Inside the Wehrmacht, the shock was seismic. Officers who had believed in invincibility now spoke in hushed tones of limits, of overreach, of a war that could no longer be won by willpower alone. The Eastern Front, once seen as a place of swift annihilation, had become a graveyard for German ambition. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, now a prisoner of war, listened to Soviet radio broadcasts detailing the German reaction. He heard Goebbels' speech played back to him, the raw emotion unmistakable even through translation. Paulus said little. The war had stripped him of certainty. He had followed orders, obeyed doctrine, trusted authority, and Stalingrad had been the result. The Soviets understood the symbolic power of their victory and wielded it carefully. Newsreels showed endless columns of German prisoners, gaunt and hollow-eyed, trudging through the snow. Captured flags were displayed. Maps highlighted the vast encirclement in bold red strokes. The message was clear. The German war machine could be broken. On the front lines, Red Army soldiers absorbed the victory in quieter ways. Some celebrated briefly, sharing vodka and stories of survival. Others visited the ruins of Stalingrad in silence, searching for fallen comrades beneath the rubble. The city was barely recognizable, a moonscape of shattered brick and twisted steel. Victory had come at an unimaginable cost. Lieutenant Viktor Kuznetsov, one of the few survivors from the early days of the defense, stood on the frozen slope of Mamayev Kurgan and looked down at what remained. He remembered August, the bombing, the desperation. He remembered thinking he would die there. Instead, he had lived long enough to see the enemy surrender. The feeling was not joy, but something heavier: vindication mixed with grief. Strategically, Stalingrad marked a turning point that could not be undone. For the first time, a German field army had been completely destroyed in the field. The Red Army seized the initiative and would never fully relinquish it again. New offensives were already being planned, building on momentum, hard won in blood. German allies took note as well. In Italy, in Hungary, in Romania, faith in German leadership cracked. The illusion of German protection evaporated. Axis commanders questioned whether Berlin's promises were worth the price being demanded. In neutral and allied capitals, Stalingrad was greeted as a signal moment. In London and Washington, newspapers hailed it as the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Winston Churchill called it the greatest defeat the German army has ever suffered. Franklin Roosevelt spoke of a turning of the tide. The morale impact alone was incalculable. Yet for those who had been there, who had frozen and starved and fought among the ruins, such words felt distant. In Soviet camps east of the Volga, German prisoners continued to die by the thousands. The worst of the chaos passed slowly as the Soviets struggled to organize food, shelter, and medical care for a mass of captives larger than they had ever taken before. Even so, disease and malnutrition claimed lives daily. Survival was a matter of endurance and luck. Sergeant Karl-Heinz Reuter survived the first months through stubbornness alone. He learned to conserve energy, to eat slowly, to trade favors for scraps. He stopped thinking in terms of weeks or months and focused instead on mornings and nights. Time, like hope, had become dangerous to contemplate too far ahead. Letters from Germany never reached him. Letters he wrote vanished into the system. The war went on without him, and in many ways, without the army he had once belonged to. Back in Germany, the Wehrmacht rebuilt what it could. New divisions were raised, often filled with younger men, older men, or those previously deemed unfit. Equipment shortages grew more severe. The loss of experienced officers and NCOs from 6th Army left gaps that could never truly be filled. Training suffered. Quality declined. Hitler responded not with reflection, but with increased control. He tightened his grip on operational decisions, intervening directly more often, convinced that defeat came not from flawed strategy, but from insufficient resolve. Stalingrad became both a warning and a lesson he refused to learn. For the Soviet leadership, the victory reinforced belief in mass, coordination, and relentless pressure. The Red Army refined the methods that had worked: deep operations, encirclement, overwhelming artillery. Stalingrad became a template, not an exception. As winter gave way slowly to spring, the ruins of Stalingrad remained largely untouched, a frozen monument to destruction. Bodies lay where they had fallen, preserved by the cold. Engineers and civilians would later return to clear the city, but for now it stood as a silent testament to what modern war could consume. Across continents, the name Stalingrad entered history as more than a place. It became a symbol of endurance, of sacrifice, of catastrophic miscalculation. It marked the moment when the Wehrmacht's advance reached its farthest limit and began its long, irreversible retreat. For those who had lived it, the battle never truly ended. It followed them in memories, in scars, in the knowledge that they had stood at the center of a moment when the course of the war, and of countless lives, had changed forever. March 1943. Eastern Front, Southern Russia. The thaw came slowly, turning snow into mud and revealing what winter had hidden. Along the former encirclement lines west of Stalingrad, the ground softened and gave up its dead. Boots, helmets, fragments of uniforms emerged from the earth like grim artifacts, reminders of how many had passed through this place and never left. Soviet burial details worked methodically, their shovels striking frozen soil and bone alike. There was little ceremony. The scale of death defied it. Captain Alexei Morozov stood beside a shallow mass grave, cigarette smoke curling into the damp air. Now, as the Red Army reorganized for its next offensive, he found himself surrounded by the evidence of victory's cost. Behind the front lines, Soviet commanders gathered to analyze what had been achieved. Stalingrad was not treated as a miracle, but as a case study. Zhukov, Vasilevsky, and Rokossovsky dissected the battle with clinical focus. They spoke of coordination, of timing, of exploiting enemy rigidity. The Wehrmacht's strength, its discipline and obedience had become its weakness. When the moment came to withdraw, it could not. Across the lines, German forces struggled to stabilize a front that now felt permanently unstable. Fresh divisions rushed east, encountered a Red Army transformed. Gone was the brittle force of 1,941. In its place stood an opponent capable of absorbing losses, adapting tactics, and striking back with devastating effect. In field headquarters from Kharkov to Orel, German officers pored over reports from Stalingrad, many of them written in Paulus's careful, precise hand. The warnings were unmistakable in hindsight. overextended supply lines, exposed flanks, underestimation of Soviet reserves, blind faith in air supply. Yet, these lessons clashed with the culture of command that still flowed downward from Hitler himself. General officers debated quietly among themselves. Some argued Stalingrad was an anomaly, a perfect storm of circumstances unlikely to repeat. Others feared it was a preview of the war's future. None of them could say so openly. In captivity, Field Marshal Paulus began to speak more freely during interrogations. He did not boast, nor did he plead. He described the chain of decisions as he had experienced them: requests denied, alternatives forbidden, obedience enforced. Soviet interrogators listened carefully. They were less interested in Paulus as a man than in what he represented, the internal mechanics of German command. Paulus's testimony would later become part of Soviet propaganda and post-war analysis alike. He was living proof that rank did not grant autonomy, and that even a field marshal could be rendered powerless by ideology and fear. Far to the east, in prisoner camps scattered across the Soviet interior, the survivors of 6th Army faced a different reckoning. Spring brought no relief, only new challenges. Snowmelt flooded barracks and tents. Disease spread through stagnant water and overcrowded quarters. Food remained scarce. Those who had survived winter now faced exhaustion and despair. Sergeant Karl-Heinz Reuter marked the change of seasons by the quality of light filtering through the camp fences. He no longer counted days. Instead, he measured time by small victories: surviving another night, securing an extra crust of bread, avoiding the infirmary where so many never returned. The war had become distant, almost abstract. His world had shrunk to survival. Back in Germany, military planners attempted to draw their own conclusions. New defensive doctrines emphasized elastic defense and mobile reserves. In theory, flexibility was now prized. In practice, Hitler's grip on command tightened further. He issued orders forbidding withdrawals, demanding fanatical resistance in the face of Soviet pressure. The very rigidity that had doomed 6th Army was being reinforced at every level. The Wehrmacht rebuilt, but it rebuilt under constraints that could not be overcome. Fuel shortages worsened. Trained manpower dwindled. Air superiority, once taken for granted, was increasingly contested. Stalingrad had not destroyed Germany's ability to fight, but it had exposed the limits of its power. Among Germany's allies, the lessons were taken differently. Romanian and Italian commanders, having seen entire armies collapse, grew wary of German assurances. Trust eroded. Cooperation frayed. On the Eastern Front, unity was becoming another casualty. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad reshaped not just strategy, but confidence. Soldiers who had once fought defensively now spoke openly of advancing westward, of pushing the enemy back across the land he had taken. The idea of ultimate victory, once unthinkable, began to take root. Factories beyond the Urals continued to pour out tanks, guns, and aircraft in staggering numbers. The Red Army refined its command structure, improving communication and logistics. Mistakes were still made, losses still immense, but the direction was clear. As spring advanced, the scars of Stalingrad remained visible across the landscape, even as new battles loomed. Kursk was already being prepared, another clash of mass and will that would draw directly on the lessons learned along the Volga. Stalingrad was no longer just a battle that had been won or lost. It was a warning, written in blood and ice, a demonstration of what happened when warnings went unheeded and adaptability gave way to dogma. For the Wehrmacht, it marked the end of initiative. For the Red Army, it marked the beginning of relentless advance. The war moved on, but the shadow of Stalingrad stretched long across every decision that followed, a silent reminder that even the most powerful armies could be undone when belief replaced reality and obedience replaced judgment. Summer 1943. Stalingrad, Soviet Union. The heat settled over the ruins like a heavy blanket, drawing sharp contrasts with the winter that had killed so many. Grass pushed through cracked concrete. Rusted shell casings lay half buried in dust. The city was still largely uninhabitable, but it was no longer silent. Hammers rang out where factories once roared. Civilian voices echoed where artillery had thundered. Anna Ivanovna stepped carefully over a collapsed wall, a basket hooked over her arm. She had returned to Stalingrad in May, one of the first waves of civilians allowed back into the city. Her apartment no longer existed, only a charred outline on the ground where it had once stood, but she had come anyway. This was her home, and she would not let it vanish. Recovery crews worked among the ruins, their task overwhelming. Bodies were still being uncovered daily, German and Soviet alike. Identification was rare. The dead were buried where they were found, marked with simple wooden stakes if materials allowed. Stalingrad was becoming a city layered with graves. Soviet propaganda crews filmed relentlessly. The shattered factories, the twisted rails, the scorched earth, all were captured on film and broadcast across the nation. Stalingrad was presented not just as a victory, but as a martyr city, a symbol of sacrifice that justified every hardship still to come. On the Eastern Front, the war surged forward. At Kursk, German forces attempted one last major offensive to regain the initiative. They failed. The Red Army, applying the lessons of Stalingrad with ruthless efficiency, absorbed the blow and counterattacked. From that point on, German retreats became a pattern rather than an exception. German soldiers fighting hundreds of miles from the Volga still spoke of Stalingrad in hushed tones. It became a warning passed quietly between veterans and recruits. Hold the flanks. Never trust promises of air supply. Never assume the Soviets are finished. The name carried weight, heavy with dread. In Germany itself, the city took on a different meaning. Stalingrad became synonymous with sacrifice demanded and wasted. Families spoke of it in private, rarely in public. The regime continued to invoke it as proof of heroic endurance. But the tone had changed. The confidence was gone. Field Marshal Paulus remained in Soviet captivity, increasingly isolated from the war he had once commanded. He was moved between locations, interrogated periodically, but largely left alone. He spent hours reading, writing, and thinking. Stalingrad followed him everywhere. Not as a battlefield, but as a chain of decisions replayed endlessly in his mind. For the survivors of 6th Army still in camps, news filtered in slowly. Some learned of Kursk months after it happened. Others heard only rumors, fragments carried by new prisoners. The idea of Germany winning the war grew fainter with each passing season. Sergeant Karl-Heinz Reuter marked the summer by the disappearance of snow from the camp perimeter. Hunger eased slightly as vegetables appeared in rations, but disease remained constant. Men died quietly, carried away at dawn. Reuter survived by adapting, by learning when to speak and when to remain invisible. Stalingrad had taught him that survival was not about heroism, but endurance. In Stalingrad itself, reconstruction accelerated. The tractor factory was partially restored to operation, even as debris was still being cleared from its grounds. Production lines were rebuilt under open sky. Machines bolted to concrete slabs amid rubble. Tanks rolled out of factories that still bore the scars of battle. The city was renamed Volgograd years later. But in 1943, the name Stalingrad remained, charged with meaning. It was invoked in speeches, printed in headlines, carved into memory. It represented not just a turning point, but proof that the seemingly unstoppable could be stopped. As summer faded into autumn once more, the ruins continued to change. New buildings rose beside shattered ones. Children played among debris fields, their games unfolding atop history's wreckage. Life returned cautiously, stubbornly. Stalingrad did not disappear. It endured, rebuilt over the bones of armies, carrying forward the weight of what had happened there. And as the war rolled westward, the city remained behind, as both warning and witness, a place where the Wehrmacht had been told to advance, had been warned to be careful, and had instead found the point beyond which there was no turning back. January 1944. Eastern Front, Ukraine. The snow fell again. lighter than the winter before, but no less cold, settling over retreat routes churned into rutted ice by endless columns of men and machines moving west. Lieutenant Ernst Weber rode in the back of a half-track, his shoulders hunched against the wind, eyes fixed on the gray horizon. He had arrived on the Eastern Front after Stalingrad. One of thousands of replacements rushed forward to fill gaps that never truly closed. Veterans spoke to him quietly, if at all. When they did, they spoke of Stalingrad not as a battle, but as a line cross it, and nothing was the same. Orders came down forbidding withdrawal from key positions. Language Weber recognized instantly. He had read the after-action reports. He knew what had happened to Sixth Army when maneuver gave way to command by decree. Yet here it was again, the same inflexibility creeping back into every directive. Across the front, the Red Army advanced with growing confidence. Operations were larger, better coordinated, supported by crushing artillery and deep reserves. German units fought stubbornly, often skillfully, but always with the sense that they were reacting rather than shaping events. The initiative belonged firmly to the Soviets now. At Stavka, Soviet planners spoke openly of Berlin. Stalingrad's influence was everywhere. Encirclement became doctrine. When German units hesitated, Soviet commanders pressed harder, remembering how delay had once saved the enemy and how decisiveness had finally destroyed him on the Volga. In German headquarters, Stalingrad became a reference point in every argument. Some generals pleaded for flexibility, citing Paulus's fate. Others invoked Stalingrad to demand even harsher resistance, insisting that surrender or withdrawal would only repeat the humiliation. Hitler listened selectively, hearing only what confirmed his belief that willpower alone could bend reality. By 1944, the consequences were unmistakable. Army Group Center collapsed under Operation Bagration, its destruction rivaling Stalingrad in scale, if not in symbolism. Units vanished. Maps were rewritten overnight. The Eastern Front bled westward toward Germany's borders. In Soviet captivity, Field Marshal Paulus followed these developments through controlled briefings and newspapers placed deliberately in front of him. He read of Bagration, of Normandy, of Italy. The war he had once shaped was now collapsing in directions he could no longer influence. He was invited to speak, to appeal to German soldiers to abandon Hitler, to surrender before more Stalingrads were created. Eventually, he did. Paulus's broadcasts were measured, calm, almost painful in their restraint. He spoke of duty, not to ideology, but to life, of obedience that had gone too far, of a disaster that need not be repeated. Many Germans never heard his words. Those who did were divided between anger and uneasy recognition. In camps across the Soviet Union, surviving veterans of Sixth Army listened in stunned silence. Some felt betrayed, others felt a grim validation. Stalingrad had not been a personal failure, it had been systemic. Sergeant Karl-Heinz Reuter was among those who heard fragments of Paulus's statements months later. He no longer cared about rank or politics. His world was narrower now, bounded by fences and survival routines. But something loosened inside him when he heard that his commander had finally spoken against the orders that had doomed them all. By late 1944, the camps stabilized. Mortality rates fell as supplies improved and the Soviet system adjusted. Those who remained alive after the first brutal years often survived the rest of captivity. Reuter became one of them, his body weakened but his will stubbornly intact. On the battlefield, German soldiers retreated through lands they had once conquered with ease. Towns were abandoned, bridges blown, civilians fleeing westward ahead of the Red Army's advance. The war that had begun with sweeping offensives ended in defensive desperation. Stalingrad followed them everywhere. In letters home, soldiers avoided the name, but its meaning hovered between the lines. When officers spoke of holding ground at all costs, men exchanged looks. They knew what those words had meant once before. As 1945 dawned, Soviet forces crossed into East Prussia, then into the heart of Germany itself. Cities burned, civilians suffered. The Red Army, hardened by years of annihilation warfare, showed little mercy. The cycle Stalingrad had symbolized total war without retreat now played out on German soil. In Berlin, Hitler remained defiant to the end, invoking sacrifice, destiny, and history. Stalingrad was still referenced, but now as an example of endurance rather than warning. The irony went unacknowledged. When the Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, the war ended not with a decisive maneuver, but with exhaustion and ruin. The same forces that had encircled Sixth Army now stood amid the rubble of Berlin. For the survivors of Stalingrad still in captivity, peace did not mean freedom. Years would pass before many were released. Some would never return. Others would come home to a country divided, altered, and burdened by memory. Reuter was released in 1955, thin, prematurely aged, carrying scars that no one could see. He returned to a Germany that struggled to understand what Stalingrad had truly been. Monuments were debated, narratives contested, responsibility blurred, but for those who had been there, clarity remained. Stalingrad was not a tragedy of chance. It was the result of warnings dismissed, realities denied, and obedience elevated above judgment. And as the war unraveled in its final years, every shattered front and encircled army bore its echo. Proof that the lesson learned too late would be paid for again and again before the guns finally fell silent. November 1962. Cold wind swept in from the Volga, rattling the bare branches of young trees planted where ruins had once stood. Snow dusted the stone steps leading up Mamayev Kurgan, now crowned by a massive statue rising into the gray sky. The city bore a new name, new buildings, new life, but the ground beneath it still remembered. Veterans gathered quietly along the memorial paths, their coats heavy with medals and years. Some walked with canes, others stood silently, eyes fixed on the horizon where the battle lines had once been drawn. There was no music, no shouting, only the sound of wind and distant traffic, a far cry from the thunder that had once shaken the earth here. Among them stood Lieutenant Viktor Kuznetsov, older now, his hair white, his posture stooped but resolute. He had returned many times over the years, unable to fully leave this place behind. He remembered the smoke, the screams, the rubble that had been home and grave in equal measure. Across Europe, former German soldiers remembered Stalingrad differently. In West Germany, the battle was discussed cautiously, framed as a catastrophe, a warning, sometimes a taboo. In East Germany, it was folded into a narrative of liberation and anti-fascist struggle. The same events, refracted through different memories and needs. Sergeant Karl-Heinz Reuter rarely spoke of it at all. He lived quietly now, working a modest job, raising children who could not imagine a world of hunger so deep it hollowed the soul. He woke drenched in sweat, the sound of artillery echoing faintly in his ears. Stalingrad had ended in 1943, but it never truly left him. Historians debated numbers, timelines, decisions. Maps were redrawn in books and documentaries. Orders were scrutinized, personalities dissected, but beneath every analysis lay the same unmovable fact. An army had been warned, had recognized the danger, and had been forbidden to act. Documents released after the war confirmed what many had long suspected. Intelligence reports had been clear. Reconnaissance had identified Soviet buildups. The disaster was not born of ignorance, but of rigidity. Adolf Hitler's refusal to allow retreat, his faith in air supply, his belief that will could replace logistics and geography, had sealed the fate of Sixth Army. Stalingrad was not lost in a single moment, but through a chain of decisions where ideology overruled reality again and again. For the Soviet Union, the battle became foundational. It shaped military doctrine, national identity, and memory for generations. Stalingrad was taught not just as a victory, but as proof that endurance and sacrifice could overcome annihilation. The city's story became inseparable from the story of the war itself. Globally, Stalingrad entered the language as shorthand for catastrophe and turning point. Military academies studied it as a lesson in encirclement, logistics, and command failure. Politicians invoked it as a warning against hubris. Journalists used it as a metaphor for situations where escape had vanished. Yet for those who had lived it, Stalingrad was not a metaphor. It was the sound of collapsing walls, the taste of frozen bread, the weight of a rifle growing heavier each day, the moment when hope narrowed to survival alone. It was also the moment when the Wehrmacht, once seemingly unstoppable, discovered its limits. The battle did not end the war, but it ended an illusion that Germany could advance endlessly eastward, that discipline alone guaranteed victory, that retreat was weakness rather than necessity. In the end, Stalingrad stood as a reminder that armies do not fall only because of enemy strength. They fall when warnings are ignored, when flexibility is denied, and when obedience becomes more important than reality. The trap closed not because it was unseen, but because it was denied. And long after the guns fell silent and the ruins were rebuilt, that truth remained etched into history as deeply as the scars left on the city by the Volga, where an army realized too late that it had been warned and that it was already trapped.